Hi BookTube, and welcome to my new video, which will probably be my last video of the year because this is my top 10 reads of 2018, which has been a really good year for me, not in terms of the number of books I've read, but in terms of just the quality of the books I've read. You know, I've read 101 books in all, and of those there was just one star book, which was a non-fiction book, and there were only 4 2-star books. The rest were 3, 4s and 5s, and there were loads of 5 stars. So I've got some stats I thought I'd just go through. Of the 101 books, 12 were non-fiction, 89 were fiction. Of the fiction, 7 were collections of short stories, though you could make that 8 if you regard Claire Louise Bennett's Pond as short stories rather than a novel. I classified it as a novel. I read 2 poetry collections, or 3 if you include Robin Robertson's Man Booker Shortlisted and Goldsmith Prize winning The Long Take. It's published by Faber Poetry, so that suggests that it is poetry, but it wasn't to my mind, but you know. Of the 89 fiction books, you have to knock 1 off because it's written by various authors. It's a collection. So that made 88 fiction books, of which 26 were written by women and 62 by men, so around 30%. You know, I want to try and up that percentage next year. And in terms of geography, 2 were by Polish authors, 4 were French, 3 were Irish, 1 was the Czech Republic, although technically that was Kafka, that was Czechoslovakia. 1 from Canada, 2 from Brazil, 1 from Chile, 2 from Australia and 2 from Iraq, which meant that 70 books were by American and British authors. I had 3 rereads in the year. I talk about them in my book postscript 2018 tag video. There were no bails, although I don't bail very often. Last year I did bail on about 2 or 3. This year I didn't bail on any. Having said that, I'm currently reading 2 books that I've been reading for the last 6 months, so will I ever get to the end of those? I have to wait and see, so they might end up being bails. And I've got a current read of one that's my bath time read, which I'm about 3/5 of the way through. I will probably finish that before the year end, but it's not going to get in my top 10. If I happen to read anything between now and the 31st of December, it's going to just have to go into next year's sort of categorising. In terms of the author I read the most was Jarett Kobek, who I read 3 of his novels this year. One of them is in my top 10, and we will come to, and one of them was in my worst reads of the year, which was The Future Won't Be Long, which again I talk about in my book postscript 2018 video. So the 4 2-star reads in fiction, 1 was The Future Won't Be Long, the second was The Forensic Record Society by Magnus Mills, which I've got a dedicated video to, and has provoked Magnus Mills supporters to come out and attack me. But hey ho. The third is Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi, which is the 2nd year in a row that the Women's Prize winning book has, in my mind, been terrible. That's not to say there aren't very good books on that shortlist. For example, I read Jessie Greengrass's Sight this year, which is on the long list for the Women's Prize. You know, I don't really understand that prize because they seem to give it to the sort of lowest common denominator book. And the other book that was a 2-star for me was Emma Glass's Peach, which was really a 1-star read, but I actually thought because she was trying to do something different and radical in her narrative, I bumped it up to 2. So there you have it. That is my sort of stats for the year, and on to the top 10 themselves. Now, most of these will have a dedicated video to them, and I will post the link to that in the description box below. So I'm not going to talk overly long about them, at least that's the theory. So, number 10, William Gaddis, Agape Agape, which was, I think, the 2nd book of the year I read, and given that the 1st book of the year I read is also in this top 10 list, you know, I had such a strong start to the year, you know, 5-star, 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 and I just thought some of these books are not going to be, you know, topped. They're going to make it to my to my, you know, year top 10, and that is the case, certainly with this and at least one other. So this was written by Gaddis as he was dying. It's about an author in a hospital room who's trying to, you know, get all his notes in order to race against time, to defeat death, to write his last book. And he described his body as sort of The skin feels like paper. He's got staples in his legs. So his whole lifetime of writing, he's turned into he's become what his sort of profession is. He's become like a book itself. And this is the final chapter. And it's just a brilliant book. 10, William Gaddis, Agape, Agape. 9, Women Talking by Miriam Toes, or Tees. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. This was recommended by Sean the Bookmaniac. It's almost certainly going to be in his top 10 books of the year, and I agree. I think his will probably be higher than the 9th position of mine. Now, on the surface, this is a book that I would have no interest in reading because it's about the a Mennonite community, Mennonites being similar to the Amish. So sort of 17th century Germanic lifestyle, sort of, no technology, modern technology, and religion, two tropes I'm completely uninterested in reading, but, this transcended that. So it's basically the women have been sexually abused while being drugged at night by some of the men in the community. And a group of those women who've been abused have a secret meeting, because of course they're not allowed to sort of do anything that would threaten male sort of, hegemony. They have a secret meeting in a barn to discuss what their actions should be. Should they stay? Should they go? Should they be passive and accept it? Should they resist in some way? But there are two problems they face. One is, as women, they are not given any education, so they are illiterate. And they have to have a man, who's also an outsider himself, take the minutes of their meeting. And obviously some of the stuff he has to do is pictorial. He can't do it in words. And the other thing is, because they've had no education, their entire worldview is shaped by the Bible. And what I loved about this book, it wasn't the characterisation, because I actually felt the characters were all very similar. They had different positions on what they should do, but they were similar because they had such shrunken outlooks because of their upbringings. But they debate, and either, anytime they throw in a sort of a biblical example of how to behave, there's a furious debate as to whether that's supposed to be literal or metaphorical. And that's what this book was for me. It's an inquiry into our language, that slips between, the literal and the metaphorical. And you may mean something metaphorically, but someone else will interpret it literally. And that's why communication in debate is so difficult. And I just thought this was a fantastic rendering of that. So my 9th favourite book of the year, Miriam Toes, or Tees, Women Talking. Number 8, Spaceburn of Bohemia by Jarett Kalfar. And again, I read this in January or early February, and it was a 5-star read. And again, I thought this is actually going to be in my top 10, although I wasn't sure if it was going to hold its place. Because one thing I ought to say about all of these books, I think all 10 without exception, I love them, I gave them 5 stars, but could I unconditionally recommend them to anybody? No. Because there's something in each of them that, So an example, Toes, Sean loved the characters. I wasn't that into the characters. I loved the sort of the inquiry into metaphorical versus literal language. So it's not a perfect novel by any means for me. I thought this was almost a perfect novel, but it sort of ranges in different types of genre or tone within it, and that might put some people off. That those sort of swooping veers might be too much. Anyway, it's basically a book about being on the wrong side of history. That a little boy whose parents were part of the former Czech communist regime, and the father was actually a torturer. When the Velvet Revolution happens in 1988, they're out of power. His parents are on the wrong side of history, and they're going to get what's coming to them. But unfortunately for the boy, by guilt by association, he too is smeared with being on the wrong side of history. And as he grows up, he feels he has to sort of, restore the family honour, and he basically volunteers to become the first spaceman sent on a Czech spacecraft, which is obviously a very heroic thing to do. And when it gets in space, it gets a bit sort of metaphysical. There's this creature that may or may not exist in reality that, he forms a sort of a bond with. And unfortunately, the spacecraft being very rickety, it sort of blows up. But this creature or something saves him, and he's rescued by a sort of passing Russian ship, despite the odds of that happening in space, of being in the exact locale. Again, it's sort of part of the, I don't want to call it magical realism, but sort of, space realism, I suppose. But he's been declared dead on Earth, which is a problem. So he comes back to Earth, but he can't, re-inhabit any kind of his former life, including with his wife, who he observes. Has she moved on, thinking he's dead? And so, you've got this sort of space and magical realism, and then you've got this sort of quite gloomy and philosophical thing back on Earth when you're dead, or, acting as dead. And what he realises is that his grandfather's words, because after his parents had died, he moved in with his grandparents. And they said, don't be a hero, don't stand out from the crowd. It's better to live your life, being completely unnoticed. And it's just a brilliant meditation on all of these issues. But again, you might read the space section and go, what the hell is this? So I can't, unilaterally recommend it, but I loved it. 8. Jarett Kalfar, Spaceburn of Bohemia, which I think is his debut novel, so quite an achievement. 7. The Earlie King and the Kid in Yellow by Danny Denton. Now, this was also a debut novel. This was an absolute delight to read. It's one of the closest that I could recommend to anyone. It's post-apocalyptic Ireland, and the apocalypse is sort of, pollution, environmental degradation means it rains all the time and the ground is saturated and all these sort of chemicals and fertilisers leach out of the ground. The economy is shattered, so that basically people can only get basic things like food and everything but being supplied by criminals. And that extends to drugs and weapons and all of that. Now, the Kid in Yellow is a young boy who works as a runner for the gang, but he loves the Earlie King, who's the gang leader's daughter, and they have a child together, and the girl dies, I think, in childbirth. And obviously the Earlie King, her father, is not terribly happy with this, but the daughter managed to wrest out of him before she died that he wouldn't harm the Kid in Yellow. But he does take his grandson, and the Kid in Yellow sort of resolves, no, this is my son, I'm going to look after it. Even though he has he's so young, he has no parenting skills at all. So that's the plot, but it's not about the plot, although the plot is perfectly fine. It's about the language and the atmosphere, and it is saturated in lyricism, Irish lyricism, and it's so beautiful to read. And, the book itself, pictorially is that sense of sort of saturation and rain. Just the urban landscape pictured in here of rust and decay and rain and everything. It's just brilliant. Book 6, Philip Roth, The Great American Novel. So I wanted to read a Roth, given that he unfortunately passed this year, and this is one I hadn't read before. I was so delighted that this is the one I happened on out of all his 30-odd titles. This is hilarious. This is an absolute hoot from beginning to end. The only reason I can't unilaterally recommend it is because it's set in the world of baseball. And I think you would get the maximum out of it if you're familiar with baseball. And which fortunately I'm a big baseball fan, even though I'm British. So, I got all the jokes, really. It is quite possible that if you're not a baseball fan that you don't get all the jokes. I don't know. I can't put myself in that position. But what's also to admire, apart from the satire, is just the choreography, the orchestration. There are so many characters with so many storylines, and Roth weaves them in and out of each other's paths and their interactions, and it's just masterly, the control. He never loses control of a scene or interaction between two characters. It's just fabulous, top read. The Great American Novel, Philip Roth. Book 5, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena by Anthony Mara. So this was a buddy read between me and Curtis, and we both loved it and 5-starred it. It was Sean the Book Maniac's, one of his, I think, second favourite book last year or all time. I hadn't heard of Anthony Mara. And it's a book set in Chechnya, the war-torn Russian Republic that has fought two terrible, terrible wars with Russia, seeking its independence to become an Islamic independent state. And this is set in a village outside of the capital where basically everyone has disappeared. They've either died or fled. They've died in the war, they've died under torture. And there's only a sort of few bodies knocking around. So there's a sort of tremendous sense of space and yet claustrophobia, because the history of the village and all the sort of personal rivalries and grudges and all of that, still occupies the space, even though there's few people left. And it's just wonderful, sort of engaging, entertaining. The characters are terrific. It does give you an eye-opening into those terrible wars of Chechnya. And just to give you an example, there's one scene where the doctor, who's Russian, she's not Chechen, she runs the local hospital. There's only her and her sister, but they give the impression that they're, that it's a fully staffed hospital, which it isn't. And it's basically there to sort of, help people who's sort of, wounded, step on landmines, and pregnant mothers. And she needs to get some supplies, and she has a black marketeer Russian contact, so she sort of sets off in her lorry to go and stock up. And she takes one of the villagers who has got a job at the hospital as a sort of the worst doctor in Chechnya, but needs must, and they give him a job. So the two of them are setting off to drive to what's the capital of Chechnya called? I can't even think of it. Whatever the capital is, and they switch on the radio, and one of them says, "Well, there's no radio towers left standing anymore. They've all been demolished. There's only static." And the other character goes, "Yeah, but the static on 98.4 FM is better than this static." And then the other character goes, "No, you want 101.7. The static there is a." And it's just this brilliantly funny, surreal conversation about the quality of static, because there are no radio stations able to broadcast anymore. And the book is just chock full of that. And there's also some, some horrendous, imagery, from war, from torture. It's just beautifully the flow and modulation within it, from horror to humour and back to horror again. It's just a tremendous work. I went on to read his other book, The Tsar of Love and Techno, which is also set in Russia, partly in Chechnya. It's also very good, but I thought this was on another level even from that. And I wish I could remember Grozny. That's the capital of Chechnya, Grozny. Book 4. This was I Hate the Internet by Jarett Kobek. This is the first book I read of the year, and I thought this isn't going to be beaten at all. Obviously, it's coming at number 4, so it has been. But I still stand by what I thought when I read it, and it's hilarious. It is not a novel, though. It's really his sort of acerbic observations on human beings as we all live our social media lives, and the agendas of the social media companies, which is just the profit margin. So every time there's a Twitter storm about rape threats or death threats, and people weigh in on both sides, Twitter or Facebook, whoever, just count the dollars, sort of money out this sort of outrageous behaviour. And it's very good on race, sort of white habitus and all the stuff that eventually led to Virginia, Charlottesville. It's just a stupendous... He's a wonderful social critic. He's not necessarily a great novelist, as I say, so I can't recommend it. But if you're interested in an analysis of that and a funny one, this is the guy. When I say he's not a novelist, he can write. His language is very good. But he's, the plot and the characters in here are really just, skimpy frameworks for him to talk about what he really wants to talk about. So that was 4, I Hate the Internet by Jarett Kobek. 3, Tell Them of Battles, Kings and Elephants by Matthias Enard. Of all the 10 books that in this list, this is probably the one I could recommend with the least sort of misgivings, because this is a complete, short, 130-page novel. Because Enard has previously written big tomes, sort of historical fiction tomes. One called Compass, set in sort of the Middle East, and one called Zone, set in the rest of the Mediterranean. And there's, there's sort of the depth of research and knowledge. But their tomes are quite sort of heavyweight tomes, just in terms of substance and volume. This shows a different side to Enard. This is light touch. This is beautiful. This is a storyteller at his height of his storytelling powers. It's basically Michelangelo is struggling with the politics of getting paid in the papacy in Rome, is offered a commission by the Sultan of Constantinople to build a bridge, or design a bridge that will be built. So he goes over to Constantinople. So it's about East meets West, Catholicism and Islam, a time of peace, they weren't at each other's throats. Poverty and splendour of the aristocracy. It's sumptuous in its detail of the palace rooms that he's put up in, but the icing on the cake for me is the voice of, he falls in love with a woman who's a singer and probably a harlot as well, you know, a courtesan or whatever, and her voice in it is so beautifully seductive and oozes sort of desire. But he won't touch her. They'll sleep in the same bed side by side, but he can't bring himself to touch her because he has the highest sense of aesthetic beauty, but it's a visual one. It's not a tactile one. And her voice of frustration and why don't you do more than just look at me and admire me from a distance. So this was a tremendous read. Book 2 will come as no surprise because it was the Booker Prize winner, Anna Burns' Milkman, which I loved. My dedicated video on it happened to have got an awful lot of views because I happened to finish reading it a week before the prize was announced, and I posted my video so that when she won and people didn't really know her or the book, obviously they went onto the internet to read up about it, and for whatever reason my video must have been quite high in the SEO, so I got an awful lot of views of it. I love this book. I can't recommend it unilaterally because it is difficult in parts. It is a bit of a slog in parts, and I recognise that. I compared it with Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange in that it has a language in which you're given no sort of translator's cheat guide. You have to just plough on through until you gradually come to understand what the language is, and you're able to read the language. And it's the language of censorship, of division, of partisanship, because it's basically set in Northern Ireland in one of the two communities, and there are certain things, symbols, words, names of people that you cannot even utter for fear of reparation, being taken out and shot. So you're self-censoring, and the language becomes sort of, a sort of accepted, readily referenceable, almost taught in schools. You don't have to think about what you can't say because it becomes automatic down the generations. And that's what this book is. It's a young girl who's not really part of it, but she understands the rules, but she's not particularly, keen to actively, follow the rules. But what she does, she walks everywhere and she has her nose in a Victorian novel because that's her escapism. But that is viewed as behaviour that doesn't compute, that doesn't fit in with what you're supposed to do. So her own community treat her with suspicion. And it's just her interactions with her family. You're supposed to just sort of, get married, have kids, bring up the next generation for the cause. And because she's viewed with suspicion that she's not going to toe the line and all of that, she gets into trouble. And it's just wonderful. It's a fabulous, fabulous book. It really lifts the lid on what life was like in 70s and 80s Northern Ireland. And yet it's avowedly a work of fiction. It's not, it's not documentary. It's beautifully realised through this poetic, slightly strange lyrical language. I mean, it's a triumph. It's a brilliant book. And on to number 1. This Is Not a Novel and Other Novels by David Marks, which again I read early in the year. I think I read it in February for my postmodern wrap-up. And again, I can't recommend it unilaterally because a lot of people would read this and go, what the hell is this? This isn't even fiction. As Markson says, this is not a novel and other novels. But actually it is. I mean, that is the genius of it. And I'll go a bit more into it in a minute. Just to say that when I did my top 10 books for the BookTube tag that Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse is doing, he's compiling to see what, collectively what BookTube's favourite reads are. This didn't even make it to my top 10, even though I'd read it by the time I did it. In the same way, or not in the same way, but that did make it to my top 10. So I'd read both of these by the time I came to do that video, but for some reason at the time, this had stayed with me immediately, and I thought that's going in my all-time top 10. But this book has been working on me all year. I have not stopped thinking about this book, what it does, what its techniques are, how it subverts everything. So there are 3 novels in it, and they all proceed pretty much the same way, in that they are collections of epigrams, critiques of artworks, sayings that people have made, basically factoids, for whatever, And Markson himself collected all the, he's a prodigious reader. He collected all of these things, on sort of index cards, which he kept in shoe boxes. And this is not a novel. The first one starts off with the author character saying, I'm so weary, I don't want to go to the effort of coming up with new plot and new characters. I'm going to have others do it for me. And he unveils all these epigrams and sayings and bon mots and things like that, said by others. So on the one hand, he's absolutely acknowledging his sources, what has influenced him as a writer. On the other hand, is it fiction? Well, no. I mean, a lot of this stuff is from real life. Real people talking about other things or other people. So is it? This is not a novel. Well, no, it's not even fiction. But he inserts an author character who may or may not be David Markson. Very, very periodically, he sort of says, "Yeah, this is my Finnegan's Wake," or this is a polyphonic orchestral piece. By which he's saying, as an artist, I can say this is whatever it is. I can define this, and therefore this is not a novel. But it is a novel. It's a novel about what a novel is and isn't. It's a novel about bringing all your reading influences onto the page. And also there is a character. There is the character of the author. And the other two books are similar, only they have slightly different themes. So the second one, called Vanishing Point, the theme there is the author's ageing and his decaying body and death. So again, very much about a character who has these fears, but again told through these factoids and the way they're arranged. And Vanishing Point is the author knows he's going to die, and like Agape, like the Gaddis book at number 10, he's racing against time to organise the order of these index cards in his shoebox, because he says if he can just get them in the right order, that is the book written, and that is the book that we are presented with. And then the third one, called This Is Not a Novel, is more about his Jewish identity and the Holocaust. And they're just supremely subversive. They just turn upside down what your conception of what a novel is. Because this is a novel written by other people, not the author, and yet it absolutely has been written by the author. This is a novel full of non-fiction, and yet it is fictional. It's just fantastic. And as I say, it has stayed with me all year. It would definitely get into my all-time top 10s, near the top now. And it's just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And that is my book of the year. This Is Not a Novel and Other Novels by David Markson. So there you have it. Thank you very much for watching all my videos this year. I hope they've brought you something useful, entertainment, a few laughs, bit of information, maybe a bit of insight into how a writer approaches literature, other people's literature. More of the same next year. I don't intend to do anything radical. I don't really have, I don't set myself goals. I read 101 books this year, which is almost twice as many as I did the previous year, but a lot of those were quite short books. So next year will be whatever next year brings. Other than Jarett Kobek's Only Americans Burn in Hell, I'm not aware of anything that I'm going to be reading next year, other than Samuel Beckett's third in his trilogy called The Unnameable, or Unspeakable. Unnameable, I think. So again, thank you very much. Festive best, and here's to a good 2019 for everyone. Till next time.